Rob, thanks so much for coming on to the show.
Scott, nice to finally meet you, and thanks for inviting me.
So I'm not one for long preambles or introductions. I'm going to jump right in because you do a pretty diverse range of very interesting research.
Mm-hmm.
So first question here. I read Shakespeare every morning, and Shakespeare, among many other works, is rife with the theme of money and power corrupting.
Right.
Macbeth, Richard III, Lear, the two gentlemen of Verona. Greed can be enormously beneficial to one's biological fitness. You amass resources.
Yep.
You can have more mates. You can provide for more mates. Those mates have lots of happy children who you nourish with food and shelter and whatever, and they go on to have lots more children. But of the examples I just cited, Macbeth, Richard III, and so on and so forth, Lear, two gentlemen of Verona, there comes a point where greed can become maladaptive, where it leads to one's downfall. And all of these plays by Shakespeare are filled with characters, or in some cases, one character who is too power hungry, too obsessed with gaining money or status or resources, and they pursue it to such a degree that it besets their own downfall. So my question to you is, and maybe this is a moral question, I don't know, but from a biological standpoint, at what point does greed, resource acquisition, become maladaptive? Is there a sweet spot in equilibrium, like just enough resources, or people say never enough? I want to be Genghis Khan. Subconsciously, people, everyone wants to be a millionaire. In the United States, like, at what point does the greed start to have a negative effect on one's fitness?
So wow, that's quite an opening question. And you're right. By the way, you brilliantly anticipated a paper that we're working on at the moment, which is about spree killers. And we did a typology of spree killers. This is going back a few years, and we found that spree killers, people who go and kill innocent people in a public place, and very broadly they divided into older ones who tended to be jealous.
To be clear, a spree killer is a mass shooter, or it's a serial killer?
Well, they don't have to be a shooter. I mean, they tend to be in the States because of the access to guns. But one of the things we found was that there are attempted and occasionally successful mass killings around the world, usually using vehicles or knives, or occasionally explosives. But quite often they don't show up on the same statistics because quite often they're not successful. It's hard to kill lots of people with a knife before somebody takes it off you. But they're often attempted ones. And the older type tended to be jealously protecting to the point of pathology, something that they were losing, typically wife and or job. So in other words, they were the jealous type, which Macbeth talks about. Or they were the ones.
Wait, I'm sorry. Could you clarify this? They do spree killing to protect a loved one.
Yeah, so they're not protecting their loved ones; they're losing their loved ones. So they're in a jealous rage, and in that same sort of Hail Mary, if I can't have you, no one will.
And then they go and they kill everyone, including their partner.
Yeah, and quite often the partner will be involved. And then there was the younger type who, and the older ones aren't just a sort of continuation of the younger ones. The younger types tended to be late teens, early 20s, pattern of school refusal, mental health, mental health issues, and they're on a road to reproductive nowhere. And they tend, so in other words, they're the envious type. They're the ones. They're what, like Richard III talks about. If I cannot prove a lover, let me at least what's his words? If I not prove a lover, let me prove the villain. The third characterizes himself, and these people tend to be more the ones who are sort of the school shooters, and they're also less likely to die in the course of the spree killing. And the interesting thing we found is that the younger ones who are sort of advertising themselves, they have a fan base, and that was a subsequent paper that we published.
The young spree killers,
yeah,
they have social media followers.
I mean, these days they'll have a social media presence. Sometimes they will live stream their killings on social media. Quite often they will have some kind of manifesto or stuff they're leaving behind. Sometimes to people on 4chan. I've got a PhD student, Keith Minahan, who's studying exactly this at the moment, and they have a fan base. They have hybristophiles, as they self-style themselves, who are sort of well aware of the fact that they are sexually attracted to such people, who post fan sites about them, and will occasionally, try and meet up with them in prison, post fan mail to them in prison. Occasionally, they will end up getting married to fans on the outside. Hybristophilia is almost exclusively a female paraphilia.
See, that's interesting, but
it's not about material greed. I mean, that's about greed, and it's about envy and jealousy as it applies to mates.
Well, envy and jealousy as it applies to mates also seems to be maladaptive. Why would you go and kill people to the point that you would be in prison rather than go and find new mates?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing is,
or this is where the products of the Pleistocene, where we're rife with, we can't control.
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, people would rightly point out. I mean, I'm sure if David Buss were here, he would rightly point out, that prisons and police forces are quite new. But also, having a psychopath around was always
okay. Take the prison out of it. If a mate rejects you, everyone doesn't. No one likes a breakup. I've I know from firsthand experience, breakups are not fun.
Sure.
But from an evolutionary standpoint, the soapberry bugs or swans don't mourn breakups. They just go find other partners.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's different is that we don't just have partnerships. We have mateships that exist within a much more complex social network.
Pair bonding.
Sorry?
Pair bonding, and then
there's that, but there's also, I mean, we're all intensely interested in each other's relationships. I mean, as and not just at the start of them. We're interested in how they're going
because of the larger. Does this have to do with the fact that child rearing is a group exercise of the sisters and the cousins and everything?
I think that's a big part of it. And I mean, I suppose you asked a doozy of a question to begin with, and I think the general answer to it is that there isn't. Have you ever seen a clipper ship going along, and it looks like it's going in one of the really big sail ships from the
sure.
T clippers in the 18th century? And I mean, if you ever looked at the sail configuration of those things, they are incredibly complex. You needed to have very smart people who study for a lot of time, and just trimming a few sails here and there, or pulling a few. They're called sheets, aren't they? When you're in the ships, pulling a few sheets here or there, can change everything. And they can. I mean, they are absolutely breathtaking. They can sail into almost anything except an absolute headwind. I mean, even if the wind is coming like that, they can still go forwards. It is. I mean, it's an absolutely astonishing achievement. But it's only achieved at the because of a huge amount of different tensions being held dynamically with each other. And I think one of the things that we have in society is, we're seeing it at the moment, where you change a few dials of something and change some of the tensions, and a lot of things will suddenly go out of whack. I mean, one of the things that's going out of whack at the moment is the birth rate. We've changed a number of tensions on things, and the birth rate is just plummeted. And people are scratching their heads over what's caused it. I mean, there seem to be a bunch of things. One is obviously the pill. One is obviously rising education. The internet's having various kinds of influences. There's all kinds of stuff going on. But if you're looking at it at that scale, if you're asking for sort of how much greed is good, I don't think there's a general answer to it. There's a sort of, well, what direction does society want to go in? What sort of characters does it want to enable? You want maybe one or two Gordon Geckos, but you don't really want. Who's the one who just? Is it Sadman Fried? Is it the one who's just the Bitcoin guy?
Sam Bankman-Fried. Yeah, SBF.
That's the one. I mean, I mean, people like him are just parasites, aren't they? But if some of their greed could be harnessed, you could put I suppose maybe it could pull in a direction that would be socially useful. But in terms of an individual, I think I don't think there's any kind of. I don't think there's one answer to it. Can I give you an example of what I mean? There's about 15 years ago, I was in the jungle in Borneo, and there was there's a village called Monosopia. It's named after its lead psychopath, who was a guy called Monosopia, and he was the sort of the biggest, meanest warrior in the village. And this is going back into the mid 1900s. I mean, there was still headhunting going on then, and the British actually encouraged headhunting to start again in the 1940s because they wanted to terrify the Japanese. And the chap who was I think he was the grandson, he might be the great grandson of Monosopia, we were getting drunk with arak in the jungle, and he was telling us stories of his granddad. His name was what was his name? George was the name of the headhunter, the headhunter's grandson, and he took us into the head hut, which had 39 skulls in it, hanging from the ceiling, and that was Monosopiad's. That was his legacy. He killed 39 people with his bare hands, and that's a useful thing to have in your village, because if you've got this dangerous, barely controlled lunatic who you can set loose on villages, they're not going to mess with you. However, he also would make free with your wives and daughters, get drunk, pick fights, smash the place up. And so one day they all sort of ganged up and they chased him out of his hut, apparently, and the legend has it that he disappeared into the jungle and was never seen again. But would perhaps one day come back if the village was in trouble. It's a little bit like the legend of King Arthur, sort of, but with more beheadings and more rape in it. But you see that those kinds of tensions were always present. You want a person like that on side, but they're never going to be completely on side, because they're. I mean, he would probably, if we could have measured Monosopia, the headhunter, I'm sure he would have been high on narcissism, low on empathy, high on Machiavellianism. But within certain kinds of parameters, he was useful to the village as a whole. I dare say he had lots of descendants. In the same way that Genghis Khan had lots of descendants. So his DNA is now detectable in 5% of the Asian population, I think. And we've got one in here in Ireland. We've got a guy in Ireland, Niall of the Nine Hostages, who's I think he's 10th or 11th century. He's a warlord here, who I think his DNA is present in something like 10% of Irish men.
10%. Why? There's a smaller population in the country of Ireland.
I think I don't know whether it would be interesting if it was the red-headed chunk of population. I don't know whether that's true. So I'm not endorsing, but he's similar. He's a similar kind of local warlord who would have
many partners.
Quite a lot of genetic fitness. I mean, I suppose our modern equivalent, which is typically non-violent, would be the Rockstar. You have somebody who is more or less socially sanctioned to have a huge amount of non-committal sex with as many women. Did you ever hear there's the Motorhead, Lemmy, the lead singer of Motorhead?
Yeah, sure.
Being interviewed about this, and he said, being a rock star, if you're a guy, is basically it's a series of obstacles we're going to throw at you. We're going to throw as many women as you can have sex with, as much drugs as you can take. Let's see if you make it to 28. Because quite likely you won't, because there's no break. Guys do not have a typical internal break for these things, so they're like foxes in hen houses, aren't they? You throw these things at them, and there was no evolutionary reason for them to evolve an internal break to those things. I'm not saying they can't help themselves. With one thing, you get to a certain age, you look back on your life and you think, was having sex with all those excitable strangers and taking all the drugs, it was a lot of fun at the time. Is that done me actually any good? And you sort of wise up a bit, and you sort of decide that some of these people weren't terribly good for you, and but you kind of have to develop that as a personal reflection on things. I don't think you don't have it as an internal. Remember, a gay friend of mine, put it this way, he said, go to a gay club, you see what it's like. It's all accelerated, no break. It's not the same at a straight dating event, even one where the women are highly sociosexual. There's not the kind of pressure for that kind of commitment-free sex that you get in a gay club. And I think Dave Busted did some study back in the 90s, was it, that something like 25% of gay men that they surveyed had over 1,000 sexual partners. I mean, there aren't any straight men like that apart from rock stars. That's just not a thing that even the prettiest of straight men get to indulge themselves in, unless they have that extra layer of fame and status and the rest of it.
So there's a lot here. I want to like comment on a few of the things you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard that interview by Lemmy, but it's interesting to point that out. Like, let's throw all of this at you, see if you can make it to 28. This
Yeah.
podcast, 27 Rouge, is
Right.
named after the 27 Club,
Yeah.
of which Jimmy Hendrix, James
Mm-hmm.
Dean, Kurt Cobain were all a part.
Mm-hmm.
James Dean wasn't a musician, but Jimi Hendrix, Kurt
Right.
Cobain, Amy Winehouse, they all died at 27. And there is not any evolutionary preparation or reason necessarily to take all these drugs. I mean, the drugs, psychopharmacology is a
Mm-hmm.
relatively new invention, and to have all these partners, it's like, how do you deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
I
Well, I bet hallucinogens aren't that recent. I'm pretty sure we've been taking hallucinogens for some thousands of years.
Yeah, well, they apparently one pretty convincing explanation I've read for the Salem witch trials is that
Mm-hmm.
some of the women were eating mushrooms that
Right.
were not normal mushrooms.
Right. It could
um,
well be a contributing factor. Yeah.
but there's, in Latin America, and I had a friend from Ecuador. There's
Mm-hmm.
just telling me about the hongos I think is mushrooms. It translates
Mm-hmm.
as mushrooms. There's like ritualistic ceremonies in
Mm-hmm.
Mexico. You use ayahuasca.
Yeah.
So I mean, but like the mass amounts of drugs, people taking
Mm-hmm.
cocaine, people sleeping with lots of partners. That's a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
I like, and it goes back to this whole what is it called? The I forget, Dan Lieberman at Harvard called it the mismatch hypothesis, I
Mm-hmm.
think, of we're living in times for which we're not adapted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a new idea. I mean, it's a basic tenet of a lot of understanding human
Mm-hmm.
physiology now, and the problems we face now. For example, we're sitting all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are sitting right now, but
Right.
I on the subject of fame, I had
Mm-hmm.
had on this podcast a few months ago this guy Lanny Jones. He was the
Mm-hmm.
editor-in-chief of People magazine for many years. So he was in and around the culture of celebrity. He created a lot of celebrities. And I wrote my thesis at Princeton on 3 writers who were kind of celebrities in their own right:
Okay.
Hunter Thompson,
Right. Yeah.
Joan Didion, and George Plimpton.
Okay. I'm fans of all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot love Plimpton. You're also probably a fan of Bill Bulford, if you've ever heard of him.
I haven't heard. The name is vaguely familiar.
Well, we'll get into this on the bare knuckle brawling. He wrote a book
I
called
remember Plimpton's book on boxing. That was his first one I read. Yeah.
Shadowbox.
Yeah. Yeah.
He buy a box with Archie Moore.
Yeah.
No, Bill Bulford was an Esquire editor, a normal guy who, to write about soccer hooligans in the UK, went and joined the soccer hooligans, much like Hunter Thompson went and joined the Hells Angels to write the strange and terrible saga of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. Bill Bulford went and joined a football hooligan group and was hanging out with football hooligans, much like you guys have a movie about this, Green something.
Is it Rise of the Foot Soldier or one of those? Was it Chelsea Headhunters? Was he part of that bunch?
No. There's a Green Street is like a fictional movie. No, Bill Bulford wrote this book called Among the Thugs. Anyway, that's irrelevant. That's like Gonzo Journalism. But the point of what I'm saying is, I studied a lot of celebrity and what like creates celebrity, and what Lanny was saying, the editor-in-chief of People magazine, or what I took away from our conversation, was that fame is actually a price that you pay.
Mm-hmm.
It's a price that you pay for material goods, for financial wealth, for being really good at something, and that it's actually not a gift. He was saying the average celebrity lives as a male like 20 years or as a female 20 years less than the national average. The average male lives like 10 or 15 years less. Fame itself is an interesting phenomenon because it also gets to this point of it enables reproductive success, in terms of the Rockstar. Interestingly, again, times we're not adapted for. The Rockstars aren't actually always siring children with all these people.
Sure.
Sometimes they are. But, fame is like, it's not a reward. It's
Mhm.
it's a price that we pay. I thought that was an interesting observation.
No, absolutely. I think, I mean, I think you've highlighted a very interesting issue. I mean, imagine, if you've got a bunch of urges, to be rich, to be famous, to be sort of socially successful, to have various sort of local markers of that success. And I mean, proxies like fame, status, money, lots of sex, all those things. But imagine if you get to if you get to the age of 27, and you're in a fairly dead end job, or you've got a family, but it's but they don't have a huge amount of respect for you, whatever. You've always got this sort of, well, if I was rich, if I was famous, it would solve my problems.
Mm-hmm.
Go for it. But what if you get to that age and you've solved all your problems in those terms? You are as rich as you're ever going to be. You're as famous as you're going to be. You are almost literally fighting off attractive members of the opposite sex. You've got the drugs laid out in front of you, and you're still not happy. That would really, if you haven't got anything else to draw on, if you haven't got anything more meaningful in your life than those things, then you're in trouble, aren't you? I realize I'm sounding a bit like Jordan Peterson at this point, but I think he kind of has a point. If you don't have something of more substance than those things to push you forward in life, you could get to that age and just think, well, that's it. I've succeeded, and I feel hollow.
Well, you've succeeded by the metrics of other people, by perceived metrics.
Right. So for me, it would be, I would get all these promotions, and I would get all these citations, and I would still feel hollow and empty, and not, because that's what makes a real scientist, of course, is having loads of citations.
Hey, why have thousands of women throwing themselves at you when you could have
you have thousands of
10 or 15 or 20 or 50 citations, or an Erdos number of 5?
Yeah, right, exactly. It's number 5. You laugh at this, but I mean, I know of people. I won't name anybody, but I know of people. And that is how they've allowed other people to turn their life into a metric, and one that's really quite thin. I can't remember who it was, but somebody pointed out not so long ago that people like Einstein or Darwin, and I suspect Bob Trivers would probably fall into this, wouldn't get tenure in a modern university. They wouldn't have the kind of research.
Einstein wouldn't get tenure. Why not?
Well, I don't think he'd have the research profile that would allow him to. I can't remember exactly, but you don't have to check exactly. But it's that kind of thing where you should look at it and go, oh, for God's, we've allowed ourselves.
Oh, you're talking about academia needs a bit of reform. I don't disagree with that.
We're poking fun at the famous. We're sort of going, you've got all this money. There was a guy not so long ago, wasn't there? There was a guy who won 30 million on the lottery, and he was dead in 2 years. And
that doesn't surprise me at all.
It happens quite a lot. I think it's like a third of them, they're bankrupt, within 10 years. And because we've got these sort of proxies for success, and we'll succeed at them, and suddenly, we don't. We're still feeling hollow inside, and an awful lot of the things that we should perhaps be a little more attentive to are the kinds of things that we've not proxies for success, but actual things that we've evolved to make us feel fulfilled, and they're kind of boring stuff, like friends you can rely on, like family, that you can believe in, like a cause that you would be willing to either fight or die for. That kind of
that can be quite dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take a young disaffected male in a dead end job. There's nothing more dangerous.
Right.
Rob Brooks, who has also been on this podcast. He's a behavioral ecologist at the University of New South Wales, which at one point was part of the United Kingdom, not anymore. And you sent your prisoners there.
We did. The most petty prisoners. I mean, it was literally children who stolen bread. I mean, it's just breathtaking.
Well, Australia's quite nice. It wasn't necessarily nice for prisoners and indentured servants and such, but they have 10,000 visas. Let's say that. No, he did a lot of interesting work on incels, which is interesting, and the idea that giving people a cause, no matter what the cause is, it can be, that's what drives them along, and if it's a bad cause, and you can talk to these disaffected people and connect with them, it can be very dangerous.
I agree with them completely, and I'd go further. It's interesting how many examples you brought up of young men looking for fighting. I mean, we like to fight. Young men like to fight. We like to compete. I used to teach
I have this book,
right?
Jonathan Gottschall. He's
Yes.
the Professor in the Cage. It's called The Professor in the Cage: Why Men Fight and Why We Like to Watch. And we'll talk about bare knuckle. We'll talk about Napoleon Chagnon in a second in the Alamomo. But go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was a school teacher for a number of years, and if you put a bunch of young men together, it doesn't take long before they will come up with some god awful way of deciding which one of them is the toughest. It'll be some kind of game where they're hitting each other with things, or they're poking each other with stuff, or they're pushing each other, they're daring each other to do things, and they so. Given that young men have this propensity, I think it's better that you direct that into something that maybe has some social sanction, has some benefits, has some rules to it, all those kind of things. I'm sure there's parallel stories for young women as well. I just I don't know what it's like from the inside being young women. I mean there's competing there as well. Whereas with young men, I understand young men's urge to compete. There's a parallel one sort of more broadly that they want to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. Once again, if you don't give them that, they will find one, or God help us, some awful psychopath comes along and exploits it. Goes, right,
Yeah.
well, I'll give them a cause. don't you fret. I've got something for them to, it'll be aggrandizing myself.
Well, there'll be a lot. There's myriad examples of history of this, of someone coming along saying, "You don't have a cause. Here's one." And on the subject of young women, they do fight. Also, they do attack each other. It just, as you well know, it tends to be relationally. They tend to attack each other. Yeah.
And I think the internet has made that just so much worse. They have the ability to torture each other in relational terms, and quite often at a pitch which the men aren't picking up on. It's sort of like a dog whistle. I think a lot of the time we don't even know it's happening. But I would be, if I was the father of young women, I would be much less sanguine about their use of things like social media. I would be concerned, unless I thought I brought them up in a way that had inoculated them against some of the things in there, because there's all kinds of things of social contagion, vicious ways of bullying, and just even leaving aside some of that self-conscious nastiness, just the constant comparison is the thief of joy kind of thing. Instagram is just designed to make particularly young women feel really miserable.
Yeah.
And just inadequate, and constantly comparing themselves against. This seems to be the theme of what we're talking about. Comparing ourselves against lousy metrics. Whether it's academics comparing themselves against citation numbers, or journalists comparing themselves against ticks on Twitter, or young women with a makeover. With I don't know what you get Instagram. Is it hearts? Whatever you get on Instagram. I mean, these are not good ways of living your life. As any of those things. They're not good metrics.
Well, they're not good metrics. But a lot of people, you talk about the Rockstar who's 27 and is deeply unfulfilled, and who has, by society's metrics, lived up to everything one could possibly hope to live up to. Have big apartment, lots of partners, ample whatever you want. And so when you fulfill yourself by metrics that are not your own, you shouldn't be, when you attempt to fulfill yourself by metrics that are not your own, you shouldn't be surprised when that effort is unsuccessful. When you go back to the Greek idea of eudaimonia, of human flourishing, some of that can come from external forces, family, tradition, religion, whatever, but some of it also has to come from within. You ask, what do I want? What's fulfilling to me? I keep doing drugs, and I keep coming down and crashing and having withdrawal, or the come down or whatever, and that's not nice. So why do I keep doing more? Why do I keep continuing to have partners when I know, like, when it's actually making me kind of sad to have 10 partners or 100 rather than having one? some of it probably gets into addiction.
Sure.
Some of it gets into this idea that we don't ever want to live with less than what we have once had. A lot
Loss
of
aversion, yeah.
loss aversion, any step backwards,
hmm
even if it's well before where you began,
hmm
right? You begin on 0 and you get up to 50 on whatever, some made up
hmm
scale. Uh, Going down to 45 feels
hmm
like a real loss, but you're
Right.
still 45 steps ahead of where you began.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I don't know exactly what the heuristic is there, but people, they don't want to like give up the material goods, even if the material goods are making them deeply unhappy.
hmm
Um,
Yeah. Sorry. What are you asking me? What? I'm probably not
Oh,
the best.
that wasn't a question. I was rambling, perhaps incoherently.
No,
The,
not incoherent. I'm agreeing with everything you say. I think we've got ourselves stuck on various kind of hedonic treadmills, haven't we? Well,
yes,
there's there's a great there's a terrific movie called Murder Ball. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I have
Uh,
not.
I recommend it if you get the chance. It's about Murder Ball is another name for wheelchair rugby. And the guys in it, they've all been cut in half at some point. They tend to be, and they tend to be quite young, the ones playing the game. So usually something terrible has happened. They've been shot in the spine, or they've been drink driving and they've hit a lamppost and now they're in a wheelchair. And they tend to be jocks because they're now gravitating towards this game. And and it's wheelchair rugby, so they've got these sort of armored wheelchairs, and I've had a go. I had a go at wheelchair basketball, which is the wussy version, because you're not allowed to crash into each other, but it's incredibly hard work. And the wheelchair rugby one is also extremely physical, because you can smack into each other and knock each other, and you're like a bunch of Daleks, just going to knock each other flying. Anyway, there's interviews with the guys in it, and I think some of the people from Jackass are also in the film, and they're just mucking around. They're just being like the guys in Jackass, just on wheels. And they all talk about the adjustment. And so they're initially they lose their legs in some accident or mishap, and there's 6 months of depression. And then they discover this game, and then they're back up. And this seems to sort of fit a lot of what we know about baselines of happiness, that the baseline doesn't change that much, that you get something happening to you. We found this, we were talking about lottery winners, and the same sort of thing happens with lottery winners. The lottery winners, they go up, and then you look at them a year onwards, and most of them are actually back to the same kind of level. There seem to be certain kinds of baselines. If you're worried where the next meal is coming from, obviously you're not going to be happy. If you're frightened about illnesses hanging over, you're not going to be happy. But once you're in a stable situation, your baseline of happiness doesn't really change that much, with not nearly as much as you'd think, given a massive change, like now being in a wheelchair or now being a millionaire. And we just massively overestimate how much these things are going to affect our mood. And I think we're designed like that. I think we're I don't know what's the phrase we can use. Have you ever seen Blade Runner? The whole point of Blade Runner is the best robots are ones that don't know they're robots. They're the most effective.
No, but I understand the principle.
That's why I've just ruined it for you. But that's what we are. We are robots that have been designed to not know that we're robots. And we've reached a stage where we can actually see some of the mechanisms now. And boy, are we resistant to it. Human beings do not like the message that we are animals. We will wriggle on that hook and try and find it. Oh, there's got to be some loophole. We've got immaterial minds that live in us. We've got. I believe in free will up to a point, but we've got some kind of contracausal free will that sort of floats free of the fact that we're biological. My own work is largely. I wouldn't have a PhD if humans would just face the fact that we've solved the problem of oxytocin mediated sperm transport. We've solved it over 50 years ago, and the fact that we can feel it happening in humans, and we call it female orgasm. That's great, and that has nice things about it. But we knew that it happened in horses, pigs, dogs, monkeys, cows. We knew that if you give oxytocin to those creatures, that will increase sperm transport, increase fertility. We've known it for ages. But we just don't. We refuse to apply that to human beings because we're special animals. The rules don't apply to us. And just, I mean, there is the day that it's you know Catherine Salmon, the evolutionary psychologist. She's the one who first drew my attention to this. It was Martin Daly, who I think was one of her lecturers.
Yeah, I know Martin Daly.
So I mean, Martin Daly, I think, said, we're just another critter, and it's a great phrase. We are just another critter. We're a very special critter, but all critters are special. And the special thing about us is that we pretend that we're not a critter, which is why I'm not a Freudian, but I mean that's really the essence of Freud's insight, is that we're animals pretending that we're not. And that really is, you could that's the I think it's the smartest thing any human ever realized, or at least it's up there, with Einstein and Newton and Darwin. That the humans are animals that just spend almost their entire energies pretending that they're not animals.
Well, Chekhov said, "Man is the only animal that refuses to be what he is."
Right. Okay. Yeah. No. I would say that was absolutely 100% true. Yeah.
But what we are is not always, good. Raping and pillaging and fighting is just because may have a evolutionary impulse towards destruction or violence doesn't mean that we should necessarily indulge in it. There is a civilizing process, and part of this has to do with stable states and getting to a point of whatever kind of equilibrium, but we don't have to just take the hardwire. It's a naturalistic fallacy, is not to be conflated with ought.
Sure. I mean, have you seen that? There's a classic episode of Star Trek, isn't there? Taste of Armageddon, where they land on a planet, and the planet's apparently at war, and it's been at war with the neighboring planet for hundreds of years. But there's no bombs going off or anything. And they go, well, what do you mean you're at war? And then they suddenly realise that a bunch of people have just gone to a disintegrator, and they sort of report themselves to be disintegrated. And they realise that the whole war is carried out with computers, and the computers just simulate the war, And then they say, right, well, it's like a war game, but it's played for keeps. So they go, well, you're dead now, so you have to go off and be. And all these people just meekly go off and get disintegrated. And part of
when they die in the war game, the real.
Yeah,
when the avatar dies in the war game, the real person has to die.
Real person has to go, and they all go and meekly get disintegrated. And of course, Kirk, I can't remember whether Kirk or his ship get designated as casualties, and obviously he changes the rules. And they're making various points in the sci-fi. I mean, partly is that we've sanitized a lot of this, so we pretend that the reality of war is a lot more sanitary than it is, and by sort of by rubbing our noses in just how awful that is, that sort of forces the hand of the people in the show. But there's a bit in it where somebody says, but he basically says what people might say at this point. Well, we've got millions of years of violence, and Kirk says, well, yeah, no, I'm a violent species descended from violent ancestors, but I'm a killer, but I'm not going to kill today. That's all it takes. I'm not going to kill today. just going to produce mechanisms that make killing just really something that doesn't make any sense. I mean, I think one of the things we do, which we do it quite self-consciously, is we play games. We're symbolic creatures, and quite a lot of the time we can satisfy what we want to do symbolically. And I think it's short-sighted, for example, to do things like ban video games or I'm thinking of the number of videos that are basically revenge fantasies. The number of films that are essentially a man going, right, I've had enough, and you're all going to die. And there's part of us that really responds to that. Now, when I was just talking about spree killers, I mean that's how spree killers think. They're thinking, I'm getting my revenge. I'm going to show these people. Now, all of us have at least a little bit of an inkling of that, because we'll watch. I'm watching today, John Wick. That's John Wick. I mean, on one level, he's a spree killer, but he's a fantasy spree killer. It's not real. It's that urge to I'll show them. They'll take me seriously next time. I mean, that urge has a component that we're all familiar with. Doesn't mean we all have to go and do it. I'm not saying that I think these videos make it less likely to do it. I think it's at least arguable that
it gives an outlet to the fantasy, like in the same way that a video game would.
It's it's certainly correlationally true. This is something Pink has been documenting, isn't it? That we're just less violent. Society is less violent than it used to be. And boy, did people resist that. That's an interesting a story in itself. I remember I actually sent Pinker a cartoon, which he used in one of his talks, and it's Steve Pinker at it's this little cartoon of Pinker at a talk saying, I think we're becoming less violent with with graph behind it. And the next frame is somebody violently attacking him for saying this. And it's only mildly amusing, but it's true. I mean, I've never seen such vituperation. And that's an interesting.
You saw it with, maybe you're too young, but I mean, you are too young. But like E.O. Wilson, they dumped water on his head.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just particularly egregious that in Pinker's case, he's documenting the fact that violence is going down, and people were furious.
Yeah.
I suppose there's always been a kind of ideal. I mean, this is the bit where it comes out, isn't it? There's an idealistic component to humans because we do live symbolically. To some extent, we live in our heads, don't we? And that's different from other animals. And so we can create these sort of castles in the air, and sometimes we'll try and live in them. And one of the obvious ones is communism. That seems like a great idea, so we'll just try it, and we'll keep on trying it. And I think we're now, how many, is it 60 countries now have tried it? So we've tried it across, all demographics and races and cultural backgrounds. And every single time it's resulted in a huge, great pile of bodies. And we just don't like to admit that, because it feels like it ought to work. Because, of course, that's also a component of our psychology. There is a communal aspect to us. Communal sharing is a component of our morality. It's the bit that comes from inclusive fitness, presumably. That's the bit that is well, these are blood of my blood, and if they succeed, even if I fail, that's still a net gain genetically. That's a component of our morality.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other components. There's the authority ranking bit. Where the biggest monkey is the one that we defer to, and there's the reciprocal altruism bit. And these are different. They're different levels, and to some extent, they pull in different directions. I think this is why it's very difficult to come up with principled long-term solution. It's why, as I get older, I just sound more and more conservative, don't I? But Thomas Sowell, there's no solutions. There's only trade-offs. And society is a bunch of complicated trade-offs that we can tweak them, and I think we should. I think there's plenty of things could be changed. But the idea that in the same way that we can be skeptical of any methodology in science, it's absolutely fine and right and proper that you look at any study and any methodology and go, well, we're going to really scrutinize that and see whether that really is a good way of gathering information. But you can't just be generally skeptical. It's not possible to just take a position of going, well, there's no such thing as knowledge. That's sort of the postmodernist position. There's no we're in this Neurath ship analogy that Quine talks about. We're in the position of epistemologically we're in the position of being a ship in an ocean, and we can change any of the planks, but we can't just get out of the ocean and refit the whole ship. We can change any one of the bits of it, but the rest of it still has to keep floating. And I think we're like that epistemologically and also sociologically. We can change any aspect of society, and there's plenty of arguments for changing one bit. But pretending that those things aren't connected, I think, is where we get ourselves into all kinds of trouble. Pretending that you can just change something without acknowledgement of the fact that other things are going to be connected to that. We're seeing at the moment, with trans rights. We're seeing a huge amount of people say, well, I don't see why this would impact on women's rights. So, well, that's because, you're not a woman in prison, or you're not a woman who's being pushed off a podium, or you're not trying to run a lesbian dating site with guys coming into it. Well, those people think their rights are being impinged on, and they're not. You can't just sort of brush them aside. And we should also be, wary about the idea that it's really easy to solve these kinds of things. And every time anyone's tried to just sort of sweep things away and start again, it's been an absolute catastrophe. We're talking year zero type stuff, or Stalin's purges type stuff, or Hitler's Germany type stuff. I mean, that's what happened when you try and just sweep everything aside and start again. It's always awful, always demonstrably worse than anything else.
It's sort of the same general framework as pretending that we're born with a blank slate.
Right. Yeah. Well,
we'll design the baby from the time he's born. Like, sorry, but the designing began, long before you were born.
Right.
and your great grandparents were born. But I think I think throwing everything away and starting from zero generally produces bad results because you will have to work with what you have, whatever that is.
Yeah, I know somebody who I think they used to occupy this office. There's a guy called
You
Dylan
staged a
Evans.
coup. You staged a coup. You got him out of there.
No, he was gone before I came. There's a guy called Dylan Evans, who's a bit notorious in court for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into. But one of the things he did was he went off to try and start this commune. You can look him up somewhere. He tried to start this commune up in Scotland, which would be done on these sort of blank principles from scratch. And I find these kinds of communities fascinating. But this is one I knew a little bit about. And I mean, they almost always end up with some guy running the show and monopolizing the women, and then the whole thing descending into some kind of violence and or madness. Because I mean that's what humans have done. They've had guys who will sort of set themselves up and go, right, I'm the Messiah. Let's go over the next. Ignore these people; they don't know anything. Let's go over the next hill. And then they set themselves up as some kind of guru or whatever. And it's always notable how it always turns into some guy monopolizing the young women for himself. I mean, it never seems to not turn into that. Let's put it that way. At least I can't think of any examples. There's obvious ones like Waco in Texas, or oh god, who was the one with the Kool-Aid?
Tom Wolford about this.
Jim Jones, Reverend Jim Jones. Yeah, I mean, there's sort of big scale ones like that everyone knows about, but there's also sort of smaller scale ones where these sort of the sort of the Rousseau thing. Let's just sort of pretend that human beings don't have a nature. Let's set it all up from scratch, and those are the times when you really see human nature. Without any of the veneer, you just get to see the rawness of it, without any sort of pretense or tradition or any of the other sort of factors that might rein things in.
In terms of starting from zero, it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about the millionaires who have won or the people who've won the lottery and they're dead 2 years later. Right. Part of the reason for that, I think, is that, and your friend Jordan Peterson, who you cited earlier, has talked about that. All the pleasure is.
I've never met Jordan Peterson. I should stress.
Your academic colleague, your brother in field of interests. No, but he said all the pleasure is in the work towards something. Getting the reward is not that pleasurable. It's the anticipation. It's working towards it. And so when you strip away the process and you just replace it with the product, it's unsurprising that the person will be unfulfilled, because the product itself is not where the fulfillment comes from. It's the process. Right. And yet a lot of people, this is a big phenomenon in America, they conflate the two. They say we don't need the process. As long as I get the product, I will be happy. I will be respected. Like, this is what I need. This fulfills the metric. But in fact, the reason the metric exists at all is because it's pleasurable to work hard towards something, to be devoted to a cause, whatever that cause is. And so when I mean, a rock star, they're really good at their music. They have worked hard, but they have this abundance of rewards. That's maybe separate. I'm thinking more about like the millionaire who, the lottery winner who wins the lottery and then is dead in 2 years. The reason for that is there was no process involved. They got the product. The product kind of sucked, and then they said, now what? Where do we go from here?
There's only so many shiny things you can stick on, the things you own. There's some you can have a nice car. All right, but now what? You're gonna have several nice cars. Well, you might become a collector of nice cars, which I can see that. I mean, wouldn't be my thing, but I can see why someone might enjoy that. But there's only one car that you can actually drive at a time. There's only so much pleasure you can actually squeeze out of that. I think what you're talking about is what's called Goodman's law, isn't it? Which I think it explains a huge number of things. Are you familiar with Goodman's law? That when the metric becomes the target, it ceases to become a good metric. And it was originally, I think it was an anthropologist who came up with it, and she named it after an economist, Goodman. I can't remember the name of the original anthropologist, but so I mean, we get it all the time. The obvious one is an obvious one for me as an ex-school teacher is teaching to the test. So you make the only thing that is the important thing for students to have is a grade. Okay, so as night follows day, the students will be geared towards taking that exam. Now, it's not suggesting we shouldn't have exams. I think exams are a great idea. But if the only thing that is of value, is that grade on the end of it, well, of course, that's going to push some teachers to cheat. It's going to push kids to cram. It's going to push the rise of books that instead of reading the book and then giving if you're an English teacher, instead of reading Moby Dick and then thinking about the importance of one of the great novels in an understanding of human nature, you get a load of cliff notes about Moby Dick. And just recite those things off by heart, because of that will get you the same grade. And I mean, it happens. We were talking about martial arts. We get it in martial arts all the time. Instead of learning how to fight, what you learn how to do is get scores in a particular martial arts tournament. And subtly you see these things change from it being the thing that it was into a thing that there's a metric for. We get it all the time in science. There's this old joke, isn't there, of it's not much of a joke, but sort of witticism. This drunk this drunk is searching around by a lamppost, and a policeman comes up and says, "What's happening?" So, well, I dropped my keys. All right, did you drop them around here? No, I dropped them over there, but the light's better here. But it happens all the time in science. You get, because we can measure a thing in a particular way. You go, right, well, that's the whole of the thing. And you go, no, it's not. In orgasm research, the main body of opinion in female orgasm research is that female orgasm has no function, and that is based on measuring in the 60s 6 women who masturbated to orgasm externally with a glass tube called Ulysses inserted into them, looking for whether or not there was and a cap over their cervix, so any pressure changes couldn't be found. And because they couldn't find anything, well, that's it. Female orgasm does nothing. And you can't go, sorry, is that what you thought sex was? That thing that you just did there is what you thought captured the whole of human sex. This is a level of hubris which is just breathtaking, and yet an awful lot of scientists will get very po-faced at this sort of point and start, well, it hasn't been shown in the laboratory. Well, neither is a supernova, nitwit. It doesn't mean they don't exist. Your job is to be humble in the face of nature, not to take your procedures, and pretend that they're the whole of nature. But that would be my bugbear in this. Well, no, it's not bugbear. I'm happy. I'm glad that people will like that, because otherwise I wouldn't have a career.
Well, talk to us a little bit more about your fertility-related research, and also your research into female orgasm.
We've got a book coming out in March called Naturally Selective, which is all about this. And this goes back. This is sort of 15 years of my work and work of myself and colleagues, because I've got lots of co-authors, about the fact that I read. It started off with me reading Elizabeth Lloyd's book called. Which is all about female orgasm, and saying that female orgasm did nothing. And I read this book on holiday.
When you say did nothing, you mean it has no biological purpose, no adaptive significance?
Yeah, no doubt. And well, actually, performs no functions, which is actually a different point from saying it has no adaptive significance.
No, it must have adaptive significance if it's happening, right? I mean,
well, yeah. Except, her argument was a phylogenetic one, and it goes back to Simon's argument from the 1970s, which is that clitorises are small, underdeveloped cells. She didn't actually say that in the book, but she said that on her website. And she draws an analogy with male nipples, and the idea is that the nipple is male nipple is sort of small and functionless, but it's still there because as an ontogenic thing, we sort of start out as being morphogenically the same shape, and then a bunch of hormones either turns us into boys or girls. Now, I mean, there are a number of things wrong with this idea. One is that clitorises are not small, functionless. Can I show you one? Actually, I just so happen to have one. Give me a second. I printed it out the other day. Here we go. Yeah, that is a 3D printout of a clitoris, life size. There you go. That's about the size of a small rose. Okay. The bit that's external is small, but it's not functionless. There's over a dozen different ducts. There are its own neural pathways, including vagus nerves, which don't really have analogies in the male. It's got its own somatosensory cortex in the brain that runs it, which is completely different from the male somatosensory cortex. And so it's just not like a nipple. And I can see why they might have thought this, but the only reason that they thought this is because they were looking at this is an interesting story as well, because at various stages, humans have known about what the nature and structure of the clitoris is, but every so often we forget it. Roughly every sort of couple of decades, we sort of go, "Oh, right, it's not really a thing at all." And if you look in medical anatomy books, about half of them will label just the clitoral glands, which is the external part, as being the whole of the structure. Now that's an interesting thing. I mean, it just the fact that female sexuality just sort of disappears every couple of decades and has to be rediscovered. That doesn't happen to male sexuality in anything like the same way. And I think there's a bunch of interesting reasons for that. I mean, partly it's the squeamishness we were talking about acknowledging our animals. Partly it's that female sexual choice is always a bit cryptic anyway. In that it's of adaptive benefit to females of our species not to provide a static target for males. Men sort of complain, we don't know what women want. Well, firstly, actually, we do. I mean, if we listen to them, I mean, quite often they're quite vocal about what they want. But secondly, if they provide too static a target of things, then that's a target that can be gamed. And given they're the ones carrying the value.
Well, it is often gamed.
It is. That's right. People do try and game it. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the functional purpose of female orgasm?
So I think
let's start with the functional purpose of a male orgasm is to deposit sperm, but
right,
a female can receive sperm without having an orgasm. So, maybe there's not one answer here, but for the non-scientists listening,
Well, the orgasm member is there's the release of sperm or the potential insuck of sperm, which is one of the things we study. But there's also the pleasurable feelings around it, and those things are different. You can get sperm out of males without them having orgasms. You can press on their prostate, and you can extract sperm.
A male can ejaculate while being flaccid.
Oh yeah. In fact, if you wanted to extract sperm medically, that would be the way to do it. I mean, that's possible to do.
I didn't know.
But the thing that's interesting, I mean, no one ever talks about male erections being non-functional. They sort of go, well, women often don't orgasm from penetration, and you can get pregnant without an orgasm. We kind of go, yeah, that's true. But male erections often don't function. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a Viagra industry. And you can extract sperm without an orgasm as well if you want to. In other words, we can decouple all of those things if we go to enough effort. But no one ever suggests, that the male erectile system, didn't evolve for a function just because frequently and tragically it goes wrong for a lot of men a lot of the time. No, I mean, nobody's suggesting women have to have an orgasm in order to get pregnant. The only suggestion, I think there's very good evidence for it, is that oxytocin production, which is attendant on orgasms, creates uterine peristalsis, and that increases sperm transport. Just makes much more likely to get pregnant with a particular partner at a particular time. Plus, it's the pleasurable sensations and the option to signal those pleasurable sensations, which to some extent is under conscious control, itself has a signaling function. So, I mean, I think female orgasm in terms of signaling is a little bit like laughter, and we're kind of interested in studying that, in that you can have real and fake versions. There's an involuntary component to laughter. Do you remember Athena at Kepis studied this a few years back? You can have voiced and unvoiced laughs. So if you're my boss and you tell me some horrible off-color joke, and I go, "Hey, boss, what a great story about AIDS." And you sort of probably tell I'm not laughing. But I mean, if you actually tell me a joke that elicits real laughter from me, well, you can actually measure the differences between them.
From When Harry Met Sally.
Right. Yeah. No. That's a great scene. Um, and I mean, so men are often intensely interested in whether women are faking, and I think that's not accidental either. One of the reasons they're interested is because they know they can be manipulated. I mean, almost, I don't know what percentage, but some 90% of the porn industry is women faking orgasms at men. That's men are paying for it. A huge amount of what happens in the sex worker industry, is. I mean, I'm not talking about sort of survival sex work or any of these kinds of things. I'm talking about stuff where people are paying quite a lot of money. My go-to for this is a woman called Maggie McNeil. Do you know her?
No, not personally.
She
I
had
also don't know who she is. I'm kidding.
so
Yeah.
she's got a blog. You might find interviewing her interesting, although she might charge you for it. I think she's retired now, but she'd be my go-to. If ever I was writing about sex work, I'd always go to Maggie McNeil and go, Am I saying something stupid here? And she would charge a lot of money to have sex with people. And I remember asking her once, do your clients not know that you're faking it? And she said, oh yeah, the smart ones do. But and she said one of them said to me one time, I know it's an illusion, but I love your illusion. And that's part of what she's producing. She's providing theatre, and to some extent the men are. Some of them are cognizant of it. I don't know to what extent they are cognizant of it. I mean, I suspect they sort of. It's one of those things, a bit like watching. That Jackie Chan isn't really punching those people. That WWE wrestling isn't real, but the emotions are real. There's humans are kind of funny in this respect.
Are you talking about porn or interpersonal
I'm talking
relationships?
about sort of any of these things where there's a theatrical element to a performance which taps into something that is a real signal that humans are interested in. And so women can fake orgasm, but the only reason that they can fake it is because sometimes it's real, and sometimes that reality is a signal that males are interested in because it had fitness consequences. Is what I'm claiming. But the fitness, we haven't really studied that directly. But the fitness consequences are much more easy to study because we can give people oxytocin.
I
We
suppose.
start.
Sorry,
Yeah,
go
go on.
ahead. Sorry, no, you go.
Well, the original studies were done on animals by giving animals oxytocin, and we knew that there was rapid sperm transport in dogs, sheep, cattle, pigs. Oh, it's a big deal in pig farming. I occasionally get invited to review papers on pig fertility because the pig fertility journal editors think that I'm an expert in it, and I just keep having to say, no, I'm sorry, I only study human. But they're not squeamish in pig farming because if pig semen is expensive stuff, and if you're giving it to the sows, then you want to make sure the sows take up as much as possible. So you whack them full of oxytocin, and that means that maximizes the amount of sperm they'll take in. So we've known that there's rapid sperm transport in all of these animals. We've known that for a long time. And then in the 1950s, the team of the Foxes, who are both medical doctors, Beatrice and Cyril Fox, they had sex with the Dr. Fox lady, had a radio telemetry device and a pressure change device inserted into her, and Dr. Fox gentleman, and she had sex on their marital bed with a receiver under the mattress, and they measured the pressure changes when she had an orgasm. And there's a whole series of these studies. They were being done at the same time that Masters and Johnson were doing their studies, but because Masters and Johnson were much better at publicity, the Fox stuff just got sidelined. But if you go back and you actually read the original studies, which as a nerd I did, and you read all the letters that were being written around it, you realise that the scientific community of the time were actually slightly upset with Masters and Johnson for rushing to publish in popular books rather than actually subject a lot of what they were doing to peer-reviewed publications. Also, one of the things you learn if you go back and you read the original studies is that lots of other people haven't read the original studies. For example, the Foxes talked about an in-suck function, and somebody subsequently somehow rendered this as upsuck, and that's how you'll see it represented in the literature. But they don't talk about upsuck. That's some kind of some linguistic mistake that's happened, and no one's corrected it, which means that no one's gone back and read the original papers, which intrigued me when I started reading them. And the other thing that I found is that in Elizabeth Lloyd's book, the one which suggested there was no function, she cites she puts some of their graphs in there which look at pressure changes, and she's got the arrow of time of the pressure changes going the wrong way. which I think is one of the reasons for her confusion. So you've got that stuff happening, and then off the back of the Fox studies, there was Ludwig Wilt and his team looked at sperm transport by giving doses of oxytocin to quite large samples of women. I mean, dozens. And if you give doses of oxytocin, then you get movement of material in the towards the dominant. Towards the fertile follicle. So there's all those sort of fertility related things. And then if you go fast forward 20 years, we got us. We did our studies where we put a sperm stimulant into women and produced orgasms using a Hitachi magic wand, which produces deep sensations inside. And then we used moon cups to measure how much of the sperm stimulant came out again. And you get measurably something like 15 to 20% less material coming out if the woman reports an orgasm.
What? I'm sorry. What is a sperm stimulant?
So it's sperm stimulant. So we got women to insert 10 cc's of a. It's actually the sperm stimulant we use is the same stuff they use in porn films to make it look like somebody's covered in ejaculate. So we use that. So it's got the same.
What is? Sorry. So you put that in, you use the magic wand, and then more comes out. What does that illustrate?
More comes out if they don't orgasm. So you use the one puts a move. So there's after about an hour after sex, the woman's sexual system rejects a bunch of what's inside it, and you can measure what's come out, and less comes out if she's had an orgasm. You can actually
because she's retained more of the sperm, so the orgasm is conducive to impregnation in some capacity.
Yes, I mean we haven't done it on. It was a pilot study that we did. It was only on half a dozen women, but the measurements were they were more than just statistically significant. I mean they were sort of large effect sizes. And interestingly, when we published on it, a journalist got in touch with us and said, "It's interesting what you say. I'm working with this fertility company over in the Czech Republic, and they report that they found that when these are couples who are having IVF, and they report that the couples who are having IVF, if the woman is orgasmic, then she's much more likely to get pregnant than if she's not."
But if you have sex hundreds of or however many times before you get pregnant, you don't know which time was the one that made you pregnant.
Sure.
Oh, generally orgasmic, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, if she's orgasmic with that partner, so that's right. We don't know which one makes it such, but it also sort of fits with what we sort of know anecdotally that in terms of IVF, quite often you'll get a situation where we've kind of mechanized quite a lot of the process, haven't we? There's, Dan Savage, the sex advice columnist. He talks about. I can swear on this podcast, I assume. Can I?
You certainly may.
So Dan Savage talks about what he calls sacred fucking. So you get a couple who they've got a good enough sex life, but they decide they're going to get pregnant, and so they indulge in what he calls sacred fucking. So they time it, and the woman's got a thermometer to measure things, and maybe measuring pH, and they sort of right, it's 2:30, I'm ovulating, we have to have sex now, and suddenly it becomes incredibly difficult. And I don't think this is that puzzling. They maybe have IVF, they maybe have a kid, and then something happens, a year later, and when they're not trying, they have another kid. This happens quite a lot, and I suspect it isn't that puzzling. I suspect that what's happening is that humans are much better at having sex when they're relaxed. They're doing the things that they found attractive about each other. They're allowing each other to stimulate each other in the ways that maximize orgasm and all those kinds of things. And when we try and extract those things from it, we try and extract the things that we thought were salient for fertility purposes. What we succeed in doing is suppressing those things. Now, I can't prove that. I mean, that's a suspicion that it would be interesting to follow up on. But it certainly fits with conversations I've had with people in fertility clinics, and also I think Lord Robert Winston said something similar a few years back. With with his fertility clinic. He said sort of informally, I strongly suspect that the couples who are orgasmic are having an easier time of getting of the woman getting pregnant. Anyway, sorry, yeah, that's the sort of the position we're in. But the thing is that the evidence for it is put it this way: the evidence for female orgasm having an effect on fertility is at least as strong as the evidence for male erections having an effect on fertility. And yet nobody would ever think of going, "What, you can't prove that male erection is connected to fertility." Well, no, but that's not how we do things in science. You build up a composite picture of multiple interactive functions. Why is it that one of the things that's interesting about this is that people are highly resistant to the idea that these things might be connected, and I think that's psychologically and sociologically interesting. I mean, for one thing, it would make us almost unique. All the mammal species that we've looked at, oxytocin-mediated sperm transport is there whenever we've looked for it. So if humans don't do that, that makes us really odd and interesting. We know that oxytocin is produced at orgasm. We know that oxytocin increases sperm transport. Linking those two things together is not that much of a stretch. Yeah, I mean, it's no odder than the investigation of any other physiological function that we find. So I think the fact that we've got all this evidence, and the fact that we sort of persistently resist acknowledging that we've got this evidence is itself an interesting thing. It goes back to what we were saying before. I think about the fact that we're kind of resistant to acknowledging we're animals. I think it also goes back to the fact that we're female choice is always somewhat cryptic. But I think there's another reason as well, which is that the human mating systems vary in the degree to which they're manipulative of women. And we talked about male circumcision. Well, female circumcision is a thing. There are 3 million women a year who have their clitorises removed in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, that speaks to the fact that there is an attempt to control female sexuality. Now, I mean, interestingly, we've got accounts from those women of what sex feels like for them. And amazingly, I mean, it is astonishing given what's happened to them. A lot of them do report exactly the same feelings as the ones that we reported in our studies. They actually can experience orgasm deep inside, but it's removing an awful lot of their capacity for making choice. It's removing an awful lot of their capacity for self-stimulation, for example. It's removing a lot of their ability to show a partner what they really like, all those kinds of things. So there's that kind of top-down control of female sexuality, while at the same time, and this is kind of interesting, you have people telling women that they're only allowed to orgasm in a particular way. And that's another thing that we do as a species. So if you're a sex researcher like me, one of the things you have to cope with is the fact that an awful lot of the people who are reporting on things, we can't step. It's like we were talking about with Neurons boat. We can't step outside of the boat. Okay? We're all of us ourselves embedded in cultures which, to a greater or lesser extent, try to exert control over women about reproduction, and that control can include guilt. It can include misinformation. It can include force. It can include mutilation. I mean, all of those things and more get done. So, I mean, it makes it simultaneously fascinating and also tricky to study.
Well,
sorry, I've spoken for a long time there.
No. It's fascinating. Don't apologize. I have to ask here, Rob,
Yeah.
just for the men listening who are interested in giving their partners more giving their female partners more orgasms, and the women listening who themselves would like to have more orgasms, either solo or with a partner. If you have any advice as a scientist who has studied this.
Okay. So my advice would be to listen to one of those. Okay, you remember I was saying that groups sort of differ in how much they either. There's no culture that's neutral about female orgasm. Some of them celebrate it, and some of them try to prevent it, but nobody's neutral about it. But there are cultures which celebrate it and they center it on the women. And one of those cultures is the Mangaians. I've ever come across those guys. So they're a Polynesian culture where there's quite a degree of sexual separatism, but the women have an awful lot of economic clout. So although they are to some extent aloof cultures where the men and women don't necessarily live together and they don't always get on, the women have an awful lot of control. And one of the ways that control is manifest is that the young men of that culture are not allowed to have sex with the young girls until they've proved themselves to the older women. And what that means in practice is that a young guy in his sort of late teens, early 20s will be taken out somewhere private by a woman in her 30s, and he will have to satisfy her sexually. And if he doesn't, he will be roundly mocked and ostracized and not allowed to have sex with any of the younger ones. And a large, we might profit by their example. But a large part of what he's being taught to do is oral sex properly. Since you asked me to be blunt, and if that would be something sort of repeatedly that comes out in any kind of sex survey or anything where women are allowed to speak freely about things that they would like to have more of, is oral sex and the ability to bring your partner to orgasm through a variety of methods, including but not limited to that. I mean, it's all, as far as we know, it's all generating oxytocin, and that increase in oxytocin isn't just a thing that happens instantly like it is in guys. With guys, we get a burst of an orgasm, and we have an ejaculation. With women, raising the oxytocin level, it probably works for half an hour or an hour or more. And this is what we were measuring with the backflow. We were talking about the backflow studies where you give the sperm stimulant and then get the woman to orgasm and then measure what comes back. Well, that's called backflow, or sometimes flow back in some publications, and that's a process that's taking about an hour. So the immediate orgasm that she's feeling, the pleasure that she's feeling, that might not take quite as long. Although it takes longer in women than it does in men. I mean, that's a bit of a clue just there. But the oxytocin system, the uterine peristalsis system, as far as we know, that goes on for some time afterwards. So any kind of environment in which that's being maximised looks like it's going to be maximising fertility. Plus, also, it's sending signals to the partner. It's sending signals to the woman that her pleasure is important to you. That you're committed, that you're not just sort of interested in your own pleasure and then running off. And a huge amount of human culture. I'm not trying to. I'm sorry if that sounds flippant, and it's really not meant to. Because a huge amount of human culture is centered on that fact. On the fact that human males have the option of kind of mating and running. Either in the short term or in the long term, and control of the males to make sure that they don't do that, or that if they do that, there are mechanisms that highly dependent babies are going to get provided for anyway, are a huge component of human culture, probably going back maybe before we were human. Have you ever read Chris Knight's work on this? His stuff on menstruation and the idea of menstruation signals and women coming together and coordinating menstruation, because menstruation is a signal of potential fertility. So being able to manipulate, he's talking sort of go back into archaeological time, but being able to manipulate males' understanding of which of the females are fertile and which ones aren't, and the women being able to manipulate that. He thinks, and I think he's got an interesting, fascinating argument, was a huge part of creating symbolic culture in humans. Well worth a look. Chris Knight worked at University of East London. I think he's retired now, but he and his partners work on that. Made very interesting and testable archaeological predictions about what you're going to find in the archaeological record about things like makeup and ochre, or particular kinds of symbolism that you're going to find in rock art and stuff like that. I mean, it's really back in the days when anthropology was fun and cool, before it started doing things like throwing people out of the American Anthropological Association, saying that humans come in two sexes. I'm so glad I've got friends in anthropology, but I mean, boy, it sounds like they really are just tearing themselves apart with political correctness at the moment, and it's just awful.
What about the soft censorship in the psychological sciences?
I don't think it's that soft.
Well, you shared an article on LinkedIn by I think Eric Dolan was the author.
Oh yeah, right, yeah.
I didn't actually read the article, to be totally honest. I saw it, scrolling the other day.
I think there is soft censorship. I think it's hard censorship. People like Carol Hooven, for example. Yeah, she got basically chased. Yeah. I mean, that's awful.
What happened to her? I'm unfamiliar.
So she wrote a book on testosterone. I think it's called
T
Testosterone,
for testosterone. I remember the book.
the hormone that divides us. And I mean, there's an awful lot of rubbish talked about testosterone. I've not exactly been shy about what I feel about what some people have written about this. And I've laid into some people for writing nonsense. Not Carol Hooven. I stress her book is terrific, but at no point would I want them chucked out of a university. It's absolutely.
Is that what happened to Carol Hooven?
Yeah, I mean, her teaching assistants wouldn't teach on her courses. She's essentially got what sounds like a constructive dismissal case, that's ongoing at the moment, just making her position untenable. And similar things happened to Kathleen Stock, who's a philosopher down. I think she was at Southampton. And the things that Kathleen Stock was saying in her book were just. I mean, and I'm once again, I'm not trying to sound, remotely patronising. I'm sure she'd be the first person to say this. I mean, she's saying stuff that is really quite ordinary and everyday in her book about sexual dimorphism. And I'm sure she'd be the first to agree with me. The fact that her academic career has come down to try and explain to people the basics of the birds and the bees. I mean, it must be on some level quite amusing to her, and otherwise quite galling. I'm sure she'd want to be using her brain on stuff that's more difficult than that. But that it falls to you to do what falls in your lap, and she's doing a great job. But she was hounded out of her position by people. And the thing is, I can sort of see how it would happen too, because it's not just students throwing smoke bombs, making threats, and painting things on your door. That's very unpleasant, and I'm not trying to minimise any of that. But also, when that's happening to you, your colleagues are either standing by you, or some of them, they're lining up to kick you when you're down, as they were with the two women I've just mentioned. Or they're just ignoring it and letting it happen, and then you've got to those students will move on and they'll go on to find other because young people believe stupid things. That's that's just in the nature of young people. You forgive and move on, but you've got to sit across the table from your colleagues who let this happen and did nothing and said nothing and allowed that to happen, and you've got to have your career in that place for the next 10 or 15 years. That I can imagine being quite difficult. I can see why somebody would find themselves unable to continue under those circumstances. No, I've never had anything like that. UCC's always been, very, very supportive, and I don't expect anything different. But I can see why some places are just, they're just betraying any kind of pretension to scientific rigor or academic camaraderie. We don't have to agree with our colleagues. I don't agree with most of my colleagues about lots of things. I don't want to see them sacked or hounded out. It's ridiculous.
Well, beyond the university itself, have you found that certain topics are more publishable than others, or certain grants are more likely to be given than others?
Oh, I'm not the best person to ask about grants. I mean, I've only been doing this for 10 years, but they tried to cancel my book. I had
Who's they?
I won't name.
We don't have to get into this, but
no, it's fine. I had a contract with Cambridge University Press to write my book, and I'd almost written it in 2016. And then I got told that they were withdrawing the contract, and I learned privately, because I had contacts there, that
some of the subject matter was objectionable.
Specifically sexual dimorphism had become a third rail. And particularly a man writing about it, but even not just sexual dimorphism, it was suddenly a third rail with that. I don't know whether it's with the whole of CUP. I'm not accusing them, but with that particular editor and that particular editorial team, somebody had taken over. Now, the thing is, at the time, I had a detached retina. I was in and out of hospital, and so I didn't actually have. I had other things on my plate, so I couldn't fight it. But fast forward a few years, and I found other publishers who were much more willing to be rigorous about things like this. So I've had a small taste of it, and it's a very small taste, and I'm not comparing myself to those people on those grounds. I'm just saying I know it's not a myth. When people sort of airily go, there's no such thing as cancel culture. Yes, there is cancel culture. It's real and it's pernicious. And this idea, that as scientists, what we should be doing is policing reality for the proles. It's a disreputable idea. And it was, openly espoused by people like Steve Gould. You mentioned Ed Wilson. That was Steve Gould pushing that, among other people. And
pushing what specifically?
The idea that that scientists should be policing reality, not just trying to record it.
He
that
himself was actually later accused of research misconduct.
oh yeah,
I'd have
I mean, he's shoddy in all kinds of ways. I mean, and he's one of the reasons why I have a career, because I mean, it was him scaring people away from female orgasm that meant that people weren't studying it. So in some ways, I'm grateful to the old fraud, because without I mean, he's like he's like the baddie in Scooby Doo, trying to scare people away from the old mine. Very people. Oh no, Steve Gould has said there's nothing there to see. And I just barreled into it, going, yeah, he's talking garbage.
Okay, I want to be respectful of your time here, but
Yeah.
I'd like to just ask, a few conclusive questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'll conclude. Yeah, sure.
No,
Having
a few final.
insulted Steve Gould, which is I mean I mean, if there were any of those on the left who were still considered me to be friendly, they'll now know where I stand. Yeah.
So now, the truth has come out. The truth has
Just in
come
case
out.
there was ever any residue. No, those people have already cut links with me.
No, but okay. In terms of cutting link, this isn't a smooth transition, but I'll try. No, I mean, you write about gambling and problem behaviors, right?
Oh yeah.
So, first of all, is there a genetic predisposition towards addiction? I think the answer is yes, but I want to discuss that.
Sure.
And obviously, it's a big cell ship. It's lots of things happening at the same time. Yeah. Epigenetics, who knows? So first of all, is there a genetic predisposition towards addiction? And then my question is sort of similar to the question about greed and the pursuit of money and power at the beginning. Is this not maladaptive? Gambling can have big rewards, and maybe that's hitting the reward center. We're going to eat big game for dinner, maybe, or we go home with nothing. So,
sure.
Let's talk about gambling and problem behaviors.
Okay, well, I mean, I should preface everything by saying I'm not a clinician. I don't study addiction directly, and I'm particularly not somebody who I'm not a therapist or anyone who treats people with addiction. Our perspective on it with that particular paper would be sort of the general perspective that I take with a lot of these things, which is from perspective of life history theory. And I mean, should I just say a couple of things about life history theory?
Yeah, sure.
So life history theory is a mid-level biological explanatory theory that explains lots of strategic options, both between taxa, between different species, and also within each species. So, for example, I mean, we one of the basic axes is fast versus slow, and so for a lot of years we thought that jack salmon and coho salmon were we thought that coho salmon and hook-nosed salmon were separate species, but it turns out they're actually the same species. One of them is small, cryptically coloured, and sneaky in his strategic options. The other one is large, brightly coloured, and has an armoured head. But you could see two of these side by side. You'd think they were different fish, but they could actually come from the same pot. Right, what's happened to them? Well, one of them has gone down a fast life history path, where it's likely downstream ho-ho puns. Reality is going to be one of risk and danger, and the other one's gone down a path where it's a slow life history path. It can take time to grow, and it's got a more predictable path in front of it. Okay, what allows these creatures to read the future? Well, there's a bunch of things. You mentioned epigenetics. In humans, one of the large things that allows our genes to determine whether we're likely to go down a fast or a slow path is early attachment. So the kind of attachment style that you have is going to change whether or not you go down a fast life history path. So you grow faster, and you tend to be more risk taking. If you're a male, you'll tend to hit puberty earlier. You'll tend to be more likely to be a lawbreaker, take more drugs, have more sex, but also sort of die younger. If you're a female, well, similarly puberty earlier. and reproduction earlier and have more babies, but be able to invest less, at least in each of them. Whereas if you're on a slow life trajectory, if you've been given signals that your life is going to be one that's predictable and quite safe, you'll take a long time. You'll mature more slowly, and you will consider your options. So, sort of, the net effect of this. So you're talking about people like Dan Nettle, who you'd like to talk to. Dan has done a lot of studying of this kind of stuff in different neighbourhoods in Newcastle. Tom Dickens would be another person who has looked at markers of things like birth weight, early kinds of behaviours that are sort of risk-taking behaviours, and what are the predictors of those kinds of things. And that seems to be, with the study you were talking about, this was a large publicly funded one. I think we had a couple of million to study that one, and it was also a representative sample of males. And essentially, what we found is nothing that would be particularly surprising. It's that there were a cluster of things that hung together. So it's not that these things were causal, but the kinds of people who were more likely to have bad relationships with things like food and gambling and violence tended to cluster together. These are essentially fast life history trajectories. These are things where did we talk about being in a scarcity mindset? Is that something
we haven't covered that on this podcast?
So if you're on a fast life trajectory, you'll tend to be in a scarcity mindset. So people will look at homeless folk and they'll sort of go, I know, I was talking to a colleague about this earlier. Why are these people making bad choices about drinking, or why are they making bad choices about the food they eat? And it's because they as far as they're concerned, that's the only money they've got. They've got that fiver, but they haven't got. They don't know they don't know where the next meal is coming from. Have you ever seen one of these tasks where you try and live on €1 a day in terms of food? And I've never actually done one, but they'd be interesting to do. But if I gave you €20 to live for a week, you could probably do it. Well, it's €20 for 3 weeks. Let's say, let's make it €1 a day. You could probably buy yourself a big sack of what would you buy? Sort of chickpeas or something. You can make yourself a lot of stuff out of that. A couple of onions, maybe a bit of garlic to make it palatable, maybe a bit of fruit. You could probably live, on 20. If I gave you €20 to live for 3 weeks, if I gave you €1 every day, you would find that very, very tough. I'm not even sure you'd be able to do it. And it's the same kind of thing, but when you're doling out resources generally, if you put people into that kind of scarcity mindset, their horizons narrow, and they tend to make decisions which just don't seem to make economic sense from an abundancy mindset. And that seems to be what's happening with fast life history theories, and it seems to be what's happening with things like gambling. In the long run, the house always wins. In the long run, gambling always means that the house wins. In the short term, though, you might just get away with it. So what seemed to be clustering together with the study we did was just fast life history trajectories. Things where various kinds of truncated horizons and what seemed from a different perspective like bad decisions make biological sense. I mean, let me give you an example from women. This isn't something we've studied. If you take you're familiar with London?
Yeah, the city.
So
I've heard of it. I've been there.
So you get sort of Leafy Hampstead, and you interview a 16-year-old or 18-year-old young woman in sort of Leafy Hampstead. You go, what are your thoughts? I don't know. I don't know if I ever want children. Who'd want to bring children into this terrible world? And you're sort of looking around, and there's birds swinging in the trees, and she's just coming out of a 5-bedroom mansion. And then you go down to Peckham and you interview a similar young woman, by the light of a burning car that somebody's just abandoned by the street. And the sirens in the background. And what we say? Oh, I'd like a baby immediately. And okay, from a biological, from a political perspective, this doesn't make a lot of sense. This young woman's got everything, and this young woman's living in this horrible, risky environment. Why did she want kids? Well, from a biological perspective, it makes perfect sense. If you're in a high risk environment, your best bet reproductively is to pump out the babies as early as possible, not be too picky about who you're pumping them out with, and get as many out there as there are, as the carrying capacity of your environment will allow, because you don't have time to muck about. Whereas, but in an extremely affluent environment, it pays you to take your time and put a lot of investment, into the few that you have. I remember a poignant example of this. It might not be true anymore, but this was back when I was first learning about it. Somebody said that if you took a young black kid on the streets of Compton, in Los Angeles, where it's pretty well, back then it was quite a violent area. I don't know if it is now. But if you took an young black 18-year-old lad off the streets of Compton and put him on death row, his life expectancy would go up. Yeah. In other words, it took the Americans longer to kill
That's
people
horrible.
on death than
That's
his
horrible.
life expectancy was there. Yeah. And no, it is horrible. But also people in these situations, they know it. They pick up on this. They pick up on those things, and so to sort of wade in there and go, Tyrone, we think that it would be better for you if you studied the law, rather than went in. He knows you're talking bollocks. He knows that his only chance. He might not frame it in these terms. He might do, but he's living in the wire. And he knows that his canniness is only going to work for him if he puts it into things that are comparatively high risk. Because if he plays the game by these other rules, he's not going to win. And you talk to the women in those circumstances as well. They similarly they're aware of the fact that if they don't have if you ask them when they think they'll become grandmothers, they are remarkably well aware. They're like to become a grandmother in their 30s, and that the only way they've got a chance of being a grandmother is by starting to reproduce when they're about maybe 15 or 16. It's and that you could reduce an awful lot of evolutionary fitness metrics to when will you become a grandparent. If you become a grandparent, you've won. Yeah, you not only have you had kids, you've passed your genes into the next generation, and you've passed down sufficient resources, whether they're material, genetic, social, whatever, informational. You've passed down sufficient resources that your offspring have managed to have offspring of their own. And that's that seems to be a large part of what predicts a lot of these things in terms of life history. So genetically, so you're saying, is it in the genes to do these kind of things? Well, I mean, it's in the genes in very specific ways. Our genes have picked up signals over evolutionary time to likely markers of good times and bad times. Whether those good times are things like social hierarchy, food. That's a big one. If you starve a population, they epigenetically they seem to remember that. And this is one of the possible explanations for diabetes. That sort of thrifty genome. If your ancestors are in, would have to squeeze out every last calorie of every that was put their way, then you get suddenly put into an environment of abundance. Well, now you're in trouble because you're probably producing more of the getting more sugar out there than you needed to. That kind of thing. But it also seems to happen socially. If you come from circumstances where socially you're being pushed down and you're low in the hierarchy, it doesn't make sense for you to try certain kinds of long-term goals, because those will only work if you're given the opportunity to make lots of mistakes. If you're living a kind of fast hand-to-mouth scramble kind of situation, then you better take the kinds of it pays you to take the kinds of risks that just don't make sense if you have a lot of status. Does that make sense? I think you might have frozen, but we'll carry on in case you come back. While you're doing it, I'll make myself a coffee.
Hello, Rob.
Hi there. Yep, we went blank for a second there.
We did. We'd have to squeeze out every last calorie, you said.
Right. Yeah, so there's some evidence that epigenetically that some of those things like famine, there's a kind of epigenetic memory of famine, or of massive translocations. Sorry, I just put a coffee on. Is that going to mess with it?
No, you're all right. We're almost done.
And I think a lot of the really interesting work is being done with this. The temptation is to think that sort of genes, well, your genome is fixed at birth, but your genotype is fixed. But which genes are switched on or off? There's a constant dance going on through life, and we know at least some of the mechanisms of this. I mean, one of them because a lot of them are conserved across species. So, if you're a rat, and you're being groomed by your mother rat, then the amount of grooming that she gives you will cause what's called demethylation. It'll uncoil a particular gene. In this case, it's the GR gene, which does a lot of things. But one of the things it grows is your hypothalamus, which is sort of kind of the appetitive center in your little ratty brain. And same with humans as well. I mean, it's basically Freud's id. It's the thing that goes out and decides what homeostasis is for you in terms of food, sex, all that kind of stuff. In other words, what's enough? What counts as enough for you? What's the hole in your soul that needs filling? And if mum hasn't loved you enough, if she hasn't groomed you enough, then that hole never gets filled. If you're a rat, you're constantly neurotic. You're constantly on the go. You'll probably die younger. You're less likely to get killed by a cat because you're jumpy the whole time. But it's not pleasant being you. But whereas on the other hand, if mom has groomed you a lot, your GR gene has uncoiled a lot, you're a very relaxed, sort of happy, slow life history rat. Sort of take life easy as you stroll around with all the abundant food and stuff around you. However, if bad times do come and a cat gets there, he's more likely to munch you. So it's always about trade-offs with these things, and evolution has provided us, which incidentally sort of implies, that for our whole species there have been good times and bad times. There have been times of famine. There have been times of social upheaval. Probably there have been times of war and displacement and all sorts. And that those organisms that have managed to calibrate to some extent to those patterns of risk and opportunity have been the ones that have done the best. And that seems to be true, for all of the species, or certainly all the mammal species that we've looked at, that they have this capacity. And we're an awful lot of the things that we look at in psychology that manifest themselves as social problems, like early pregnancy, that would be something that's a social problem. Young women getting pregnant when they're 15 or 16, and the politicians will every so often get cross about it, and they'll think, well, these young women, they don't know about contraception. They know more about contraception than the politicians. They're not, or they need educating. Well, they're smart enough. They're plenty smart. They might be using their smarts to rationalize some decisions which people in less risky positions might not make. But it's not about education or intelligence, and it's not in any easy, obvious way about morality either. The decisions that they're making are increasing their fitness. They might be producing lots of babies that the rest of society has an issue with, although we're actually the problem at the moment is we're not producing enough babies. That would seem to be the more pressing issue. Or they might be producing, if you've got children under really extreme conditions, then the rest of us sort of have to deal with sort of extreme fast life history people, because they're massive risk takers, drug takers, violent, all the rest of it. So we might want to help people recalibrate, but that's very different from sort of taking a kind of finger waggy. What I'm looking for, tabloid newspaper position on it, which just firstly isn't going to work, and secondly, it's not clear why you think it would be better like that. Not you, I mean, one. Sorry,
no.
I suppose what's has that answered the? I mean, why do we gamble? Because some of us are more calibrated for a more risk-taking environment, and we're more likely to rationalize that. I think there's other things going on there. You're saying, are there addictive properties? Absolutely. I mean, there's individual differences here. And one of the things that we, as a society, we might do is look at the way that certain individual weaknesses are just flat out exploited by some very bad actors in our society. In this case, I'm thinking about. Are you familiar with the concept of whales in WHALES in gambling? So you've got if you've got a bell curve, but it's got a very long. Sorry, I'm on the screen there. A bell curve with one very elongated bit to it. That tail is the whole thing looks like a whale. Mm-hmm. Well, the whales are the people at that end of the bell curve. They're the ones who find it really difficult to resist the urge to gamble. And a lot of gambling companies target them deliberately and directly. They try and draw them in because they're the ones paying for everyone else. If you go and gamble 4 or 5 times a year or something, you don't have a habit. You're enjoying it. But there are some people whose their houses will go, their families will go, everything will go once they're caught up in a loop of it. And I've met people who'll spend all day just putting money in a machine, almost
slot machines,
almost like all those fixed rate betting machines. Those fixed rate betting machines were specifically designed to try and keep people just on the edge, of giving up, so you could drain all their money away. I remember as a kid, this probably what started off my career in psychology. I remember as a kid, I'd be about 5 or 6, and I was taken off in a Rolls Royce to a birthday party, and it was very exciting because the house had pillars in it. And I do remember this. I remember it had a swimming pool inside, because I love swimming. So that really interested me. And I came back and sort of told my mum I was all excited about this birthday party, and and she said, "Well, that was the Gottlieb family. One of the Gottlieb kids was at my school, and they sent a suite of Rolls Royces to pick us up. I wasn't particularly wealthy. I just was living in London. They sent Rolls Royces to pick up all the kids in the school and take them all to this party, which was in Millionaires Row in this house, which had a pool inside and pillars. And the reason that it was the Gottlieb family, the reason they were that rich, and I remember talking to my mum about this at an early age. She said, "Well, they're the ones who make all those machines, those the slot machines, with the one-armed bandits." And she explained to me how that worked and how that worked. She didn't. I don't think she used these terms, but she explained to me how these were basically Skinner boxes for humans. And that's what they were. They just reward humans with various kinds of proxies of success, and try and trap you. And there'll be some people who'll get trapped and they'll just put all their money into it, and that's what paid for that swimming pool. And it must have stuck with me because it's nearly 50 years ago, and I still remember having this conversation, thinking that's a pretty shitty way to treat people, but it's perfectly legal, And I'm not sure that I'm not sure I'm comfortable with just sort of banning gambling. I'm not sure banning any of these things helps. But that doesn't mean they can be completely unregulated, or that they can be complete. We could be cognizant of some of the hinge points in human nature, and put in a few safeguards, I think, so that it's what we started off by talking about, this rather boring realization as you enter middle age that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Sorry about it.
No,
sorry,
Thomas Sowell was right.
A more simple, crashy kind of finale.
No, look, I think we've covered an enormous amount of ground.
Sure.
And I really appreciate your coming onto the show. No, this was a lot of fun.